So I believe that it is the will and the skill that can make inclusive education work. We've been doing some really exciting work in the Bachelor of Education degree at QUT, particularly in regard to the will and the skill components of this debate, that can really make a difference for how prepared teachers are to work in inclusive ways in schools. However, before I talk about the will and the skill and what is needed for preparing our teachers to work in more inclusive ways, I need to give you some background about how my thinking has evolved over time and what makes me believe that these components of will and skill are the most important in this debate. I was trained as a special education teacher here at Griffith University in Brisbane and began teaching in the 80s, as did some of my colleagues who are here. One of my first teaching positions was at a special school for children that was located in the grounds of an institution for people who had physical and multiple disabilities in Townsville. So many of you will know where that place was. Over 4 years of teaching at this location, I taught classes from the baby group right through to the young adult group, and many of my students were wards of the state. Some of the children only saw their parents in holidays or weekend visits. So this was in the 80s, the end of the 80s. This type of setting was extremely segregated, and the teachers worked hard to provide a positive education program with lots of work in the local community. So we were constantly, trying to get our students out into the community, away from the institution. In 1989, I worked in London at a special school that was also very segregated. My class was made up of kindergarten children, and these children had a range of disabilities. They had little, if any, verbal language, and most of the children had very unusual patterns of behaviour. Because the children lived in council high-rise accommodation in London and came to school every day in a school bus, they had little interaction with children who did not have disabilities. So it wasn't long before each child did not just have one unusual behaviour, they copied each other, and we had a whole room of children who had 4 or 5 behaviours that were not socially acceptable. I worked in the teachers in this school to provide positive education experiences and tried to extend the children's experience and learning in the real world, which I must say was a lot of fun because we were in London. I returned to Australia in 1990 when an integration approach in our education system in Queensland was really well on its way, that was really informed by a very strong parent advocacy approach in Queensland at that time. So there were many special education units being built in primary and secondary schools. I was working in Cairns at the time, and the special school was closed down in Cairns. That was 1990. All children with disabilities were enrolled in primary and secondary schools in Cairns at that time. The focus for our special education teachers was on getting the children with disabilities ready to join the regular classroom. So remember, the approach at that time was integration. We weren't really up to inclusion at that point in time. So our focus was on integration, which had a very strong focus on disability, which is very different to the inclusive education approach today that really focuses on education for diversity, as where are you? Over there, as Bob said before. So the focus for teachers in the integration stage of education was on teaching the normal curriculum and then considering how children with different needs needed support. It was common for special education teachers like me at that time to provide extra resources, modified activities and withdrawal teaching programs in special education units. Some of the special education units operated like segregated special schools in the grounds of primary and secondary schools, so a bit like the cartoon, that Bob put up there before. And some special education units still operate like this today and could not really be described as inclusive, which reinforces that focus that Bob's already talked about. It's not about the physical location. I was head of a special education unit at a school in Cairns where the principal and school community were very keen to welcome and include children with disabilities. Some teachers were not so keen, but they were gradually involved and could see the enormous benefits for everybody. This is where I learnt the difference between integration and inclusion.